And I'll disable my camera as well. Feel free to do the same on your end. So let me share my screen. First off, I wanted just to highlight, and I hope you see this as well, that I enabled recording yesterday. So there's a 45 minutes video to be reviewed here. If you need to go back and look at what we talked about, it's on this site for 120 days. I downloaded a copy of this file for posterity. What I think I'll do eventually is to collect all of these seminar videos and then create a YouTube channel for this that we can actually use later on. But if you wanted to look at what we've seen, gone through before I put up this on YouTube, it'd probably be a month or two until I do that. Then you will know how to get these playbacks. So I wanted to highlight one thing in WebStorm, which is also the case for Radar, which is why I tend to use this as a Git visual client. A standard way of organizing your Git changes is as a flat list you see here. Now, in fact, I only have meaningful changes in these 3 source files. So when I wanted to publish this to GitHub, I need to make sure that I only submit changes that I made to these 3 files. I never submit temporary changes that I made in these other files, which is part of the runtime that I have configured for my machine. So using this approach is quite tedious and prone to overlooking that you are committing changes that should be local only. So the way I organize things is that first off, I often choose to organize by directory. And then what I do is that I make use of a functionality which is kind of unique, I think, so far for this Git client. Maybe other clients has it, but this has it. So I have the possibility to create a new change list. Let me create one. I standardize myself to have 2 extra change lists. So I have one called local and I have one called temp. In the local folder, I often place my configuration file for the local environment. So you would see that in this case, I changed the database name, and it should not be saved to GitHub. But that's something I usually do, and I want to, and that is the configuration for everything else that is part of the runtime environment. So next step would be to separate out everything else. So let me do that. So I'll move everything else down to temp. And then lastly, I want to make sure that I pick the files that I actually have made changes to and move them up to the changes, the top one. Now you will see that if I collapse, then I have separated out 3 files, which are the files I need to make or commit and changes to. Actually, this is one of them. Sorry. Expand everything. I think I had, there we go. Let me move this as well, so up to there. So yeah, now we can see it expand everything. These 3 files are actually what I intend to submit quite soon to GitHub as fix for this crash in develop. But now I can just select these 3 and write my commit message and commit. And it will not be a danger that I should be committing things I don't want committed. And in fact, if I make further changes now, and this would not be containing any files, then since this is the active change list, the changes I currently make will be introduced into this top one and not introduced into the bottom one. So this separation is actually maintained when I do new edits. So I don't actually have to separate out the files like I did now. That's kind of permanent now. So hopefully you'll appreciate the benefit of having the source files separate from each other. Okay, so that was sidetracking. Let me close everything here. And then let me go back to today's topic, which is clean coding principles. At the bottom, you would see that I added a link to a video, as I said. I do encourage everyone to take a look at that when you have time. As a developer, I think it's good to know what a good practice is. Often when you have been developing for quite some years, you might be kind of set in your ways. You have kind of your own way of doing things. This lecture will kind of refresh you in that way. You should, after seeing this lecture, you will have kind of new eyes, I think, to what would be considered like a good coding practice. There's lots of different types in these lecture seminars, and most are quite useful to be seen and studied. But I think not only do you learn, but also you get encouraged actually to practice clean coding. Now, before I go into the details here, I'd like to use an analog to clean coding, and say that you are given the keys to a friend's apartment, and you're going to arrive on Saturday morning, and your friend had a party going on Friday night, and he left for some destination and gave you the keys. And when you arrive on Saturday morning, the flat is kind of a mess. There's beers everywhere, there's trash scattered around. And what do you do when you enter the apartment and you want to live there for a weekend? Do you just sit down on your couch and let everything be as they are? I think your first inclination is to try to clean up. So you will put the trash in the trash can, and you will collect all the beer bottles in a sack for later disposal. So that's kind of idea of visiting a new place and cleaning up before you leave is what I want to have you think about when you're coding in Adrega as well. When you open a source file, that's when you enter the apartment, right? If you see some trash in the source file, you immediately clean it up. If you think that there could be some structures to the file which is not been put in place yet, like collecting the beer cans in a container, if you see some variables that might be good to host in a class, collect it in a class. So it'd be good actually if you could take this mental picture and apply it to your approach to coding and opening a source file in Adrega. Yeah, let me just the actual introduction then. Clean coding, I think it will benefit everyone in the long run, and also actually in the short run. First issue is kind of a continuation of what we talked about yesterday, where we talked about using casing for variable names, folders, and structures. We didn't actually talk about what the name should be and how it should read, but it's very important that you give the name a descriptive writing. It should be possible to read the name of the function or the variable, and from the name get a sense of what it's going to be used for. It used to be that we also included in the variable name some indication to what type the variable was. Sometimes we used underscore to indicate it was a member of a class. I wouldn't necessarily see that it's needed anymore. If you look to the coding environment, the editing functionality we have in the editors, you have IntelliSense everywhere. So I think as an assumption, you would always use a coding editor that support IntelliSense. And it means that if you are curious about the type of a variable, you just point the mouse to the variable and it will read to you the type of the variable. Given that everyone should have access to that IntelliSense functionality, there's no longer any need to give the name something called like int or double, unless the type itself is the property of the variable. So yeah, don't include in the descriptive naming the type, please. There's one additional technique that you can apply to make the code more readable. Sometimes you have an if condition consisting of many different terms. Often you're testing for a certain property, so it will be good actually to highlight what you are testing for. So for instance, instead of having a test for that you make on several variables, then you can say if this is a project entity, for instance. Let me actually illustrate that. Let me open, sorry, that wasn't my intent. Top left. Top left. Okay, this didn't disappear. Doc. Okay, there we go. Let me edit this so that it gives meaning to it. Where was I? Non-trivial conditions should be written as variables. So say that I have if a equals 3 do something. What I would do instead is do like this. So now you know that in this setting, you're actually testing for A being a project entity, right? So this is much easier to read than this. And this is a very trivial example. Often you would have like an and or maybe bigger or equal. So imagine that this expression you are actually naming is more complex and non-trivial. In that case, it's very useful to have the test condition described in a variable. So you will see that when I do coding and refactoring, I often introduce new variables just to store the condition for some if tests or while tests. Comments should be mostly unnecessary. I believe in that you should be able to create a coding descriptive with meaningful names and meaningful variables that almost should read like a sentence. So if you need to add some extra comments, it should be like for a reference for an article that might explain the logic of the algorithm that you're implementing, or some other aspects that are not easy to read out of the code. Please avoid comments. And this includes comments that are directly referencing to bugs. So if I open a source file, then it's trivial to know who wrote this line. You can see here on the Radar API, I have highlighting already on the right side to what user made change to this line last time. There's also a function called blame. This is supported also in Visual Studio. I can turn on. And if I turn it on, you will see that on the left side here, so there's a track of all the changes. The last changes are mentioned here. So I know that, for instance, here I made some code changes in this area. So having the tooltip you see here and the blame functionality annotation, there's no longer any need for having comments in the source code which references the bug that you're actually working on. So again, there's less use of commenting that you need to add. I had this idea of collecting beers in a container, right? Instead of having like 10 beer bottles in the apartment spread around, you get a more sense of it being less cluttered by putting those beer cans into a bag and storing on and move it on the side, right? So that's called decluttering. And when you do clean coding, you often find a collection of variables that are residing in the same space. Often these variables could be joined up into a structure, a class, or interface. And it means that you no longer have to consider each variable individually when you can actually interrogate the set of variables as a collective entity. And that makes a big difference in reading the code. And so basically, if you have variables which are constructed at the same time, often processed at the same time and destructed at the same time, then these variables should be collected in a class or interface. And clean coding is often hinted at being a functional programming paradigm. I don't know if you know the term object-oriented programming versus functional programming, but basically one of the benefits of functional programming is that it's much easier to study and read. It's also easier to parallelize. And there's two principles that you should follow to make that happen, even in C#. One is to avoid side effects as much as possible. I'll show you some example later on. But it means that you should avoid functions that return a value and modify its parameters. And also, if you have a getter or setter function in the class, it shouldn't do anything other than getting the value or setting the value. If it needs to do something else, you probably will be better off by creating a function to do these operations, not a getter or setter. I think by convention, when you have a getter or setter functionality, you don't expect anything else than you being you having returned the value or you're setting the value. If something else happens, make it a function. Also, if you have a function which have lots of parameters, it's a very good candidate for refactoring, because having so many parameters, often it will be doing many things. Same thing if your function has a lot of levels of indentation, then it's often doing too many things. And also, if it's a very large function, then you might want to consider splitting it up. But basically, a function should mainly be doing one thing, and that makes the function easy to understand. I would also say that this might be considered like a split and conquer approach. This is something that we have been not good at following so far. So often when we do development, we take something that has been created from before, make a copy of it, and then slightly modify it and store it as a new solution. And that is kind of copy-paste problem. I think as you do development, it's a good policy to start doing this, because you might not know how the final solution would be. So, but if you are actually copying existing code, then before you finish your work, you should actually carefully consider if there are possibility to join the two solutions into one solution. Often you will find that it is possible. Maybe not very easy, but if you can spend a few more hours finding a common solution where the code isn't duplicated, then certainly it's worth a few hours extra work on doing that. Having clean code also allows you easier access to code to create the unit tests and performance and integration tests. One thing I forgot to actually is make a highlight is that one of the principles in clean coding is to separate out data and logic into smaller files. And having many small files compared to just a few large files gives you the extra benefit in that you will have less Git merge conflicts. More often you would make a change to a small file to fix a bug, for instance, or to add a new feature. You will create a set of new small files. And when you merge that change back into the main repository, you will often find that there might be some overlap, but very little overlap because the code is spread on so many different files. So Git merge and Git conflict resolution becomes lots of easier. Yeah, so as part of clean coding, I would say creating unit test, performance, and integration test is important. I will return back to unit test creation and performance creation in a later seminar, so I won't go into details, but that's certainly one of the principles you should adhere to. Also, as I said, in Radar, it's possible to enable code coverage. I will also again show you that when we get to this session. It's also possible technically in WebStorm, but I tried this out the other day and it was not possible using our current development environment. We need to update some Karma package files, which I haven't done yet, but I will certainly look into that quite soon. So before I go into coding, are there any comments on these principles? Are they new to you, or do you not agree that these are good principles to follow?
Fully agree.
Good. Okay, so let me start showing some examples. And I'll start in Radar. And I'm understanding from you, Olga, is that you tried actually to see if these refactoring tools were available for you in Visual Studio using ReSharper, and you found that they were not. Is that correct?
Yes, as I remember, this Radar functionality was kind of ReSharper part, but currently it's not, and I was really disappointed with that. And yesterday I requested this Radar license, and it's quite good enough. It's faster than Visual Studio, and it makes me actually happy. So it's really nice news that they just move it to separate tool, let's say.
That's good. And there were no problem for you to get license from Arcadia on it?
No, just a couple of hours, I think.
In that case, I would like Anatoly and Alexei, you send similar requests to Arcadia. I think both of you will be developing C# going forward, in addition to TypeScript. So in C# certainly when we want to do refactoring, and I do encourage everyone to do that when you, as I said, when you enter the apartment and you find it's being quite messy, then of course your first inclination would be to try to clean up, right? And having no support for that in your development editor doesn't allow you to actually be as flexible and do the good job that you should do at any one time. So Anatoly and Alexei, I do want you now to contact Arcadia and request a license for Radar, and just say what Olga said. I probably said that it's a requirement for working on a Andrega project because Radar has these clean coding support that is not supported or not available for Visual Studio. So if you needed something argument to for why you are going to request that, just say that it's now a requirement to be working on the Andrega team. Okay. So I just picked this one to illustrate some easy refactoring techniques. But before I go into that, let me just show you that one thing which I've been using more and more is actually what in Radar and WebStorm is called code folding. I think it's a general term. You will more likely find it also in Visual Studio or Visual Studio Code. But if you see search for fold, by the way, what I'm doing now is to use this find action sequence. If you enter fold, you will see number of options for code folding here, right? So what I tend to do is that I try to use Control Numpad 1, for instance. It will then fold everything to this level. If I do the same to this level, then you can see more of the file, and again this level. Now, if you pay attention to the green icon here, I think this is an extension I installed for Radar, Olga. It has to do with what is this term, the cyclomatic complexity. I find it a very good assistant for me to quickly scan C# code and look for red icons. It's like a smiley, right? As soon as you see something red, then you know to investigate. And in this case, this was one of the functions I found by just visually scanning like this to be a good candidate for refactor. So, okay, so let me just expand on this and go through a good refactoring technique. So the first thing I would like to show you is how to refactor the argument list. So these are 4 arguments to this function. 4 is probably not considered a high number, but certainly if you find that the function is receiving 5 or 6 even inputs, then you should consider applying a technique to refactor the parameters into a structure. So if I open the refactoring menu, then I have something called transform parameters. And if I do that, let me just copy this into my cut clipboard. Then again, sorry. So transform parameters, and then I'll give this. This is actually a web service. So let me do like request. And there's a naming convention that we kind of follow already in Adrega. If it's input to a web service, and then the structure often is called a request. If it's a regular function, I myself have been using args as a convention, but it's up to you actually. I don't want to dictate what your naming convention would be. It should be understood and easily read, of course, but feel free to choose what you want. If I do this refactoring, you will see that now the input is a single input. I like to just rename to be request because it's understood inside a function what a request is. Now you would see that if I go to my change list now, commits, I introduce a few more changes. So one is the interface file, which the admin service implements. You would see that since I'm doing the refactoring with the refactoring support, it's already knows to change the input in this interface file to match the actual change I made in admin. So again, this is a very good benefit for refactoring tool. It's actually kind of a safe way to do code changes. It actually makes sure that the changes you make are consistent throughout. You will see that it introduced a structure. I often like to move it to a separate file. So let's do that. Now it's a separate file, so it doesn't clutter up the main class. Let me go back. So yeah, you know that I now transform the parameters to a simple input. If we take a look at the global scope of this function, one thing you might notice that is doing an if test, doing something and then returning users. But there's actually easy workaround on this. If you do the inverse, you can see most of the function is under this indent level. So the largest scope of the function is in this indent level, but you can fix that. And you can see there's a helpful hint here, invert if. So basically what I've done now is that I'm getting an empty list of users. And if the input is such that we shouldn't return on something other than the empty list, then we do the immediate return like this. In fact, I would do, to be honest, I would do like this. So it should be a collection. That wouldn't be a good idea. Okay, let's do that like this. But if it had been an array that returned, I would use a different way of doing this, because it doesn't actually easily read that this is an empty list. But an area, empty array would be easy to read. Yeah, so it's a collection, so can't do that. Anyway, another thing is that if I collapse on this one, you will see it makes a check if entry not equal to 0. It disposes it. But now I looked at the use pattern for this variable, and you can see that there's only one setter. So there's no need to check for null value here. It will always be defined. So you can easily simplify the code like this. Another thing you can see now, the most of the function is actually within the try here. So let's actually refactor. Let me open the refactor menu, and so as a method. So now you can see the red icon is now green. It's simple enough, it says, and it's easy to read. So basically, if there's nothing to be done, you turn to empty list, and then you do your stuff, and then you dispose on the entry that you created up here. So very easy to read. Now, what I'm going to do now is introduce a technique which I haven't seen, but applying more and more myself, to further refactor this and simplify it. It's important to isolate the function from its environment. So you know that this is a class function, and as such, it's have access to all the classes properties, and as such, it's quite difficult to know if it's safe to move this function to another context, because it might be relying on many different properties of the class. So one very easy technique to get understanding of the dependency of the function to the class environment is actually to make it static. And this is in TypeScript. So actually part of my refactoring technique is to convert functions to static functions. And you will see now I have a red indication on the side, which indicates here's a dependency, which it now being static isn't honored again anymore. So what I could do is examine this dependency and see what it does. And you can see here, this function is only handling some input and returning some output. It doesn't actually use any start class properties. So I can make this static as well. It doesn't like that. Implement messaging service. Okay, let's return back to this I think it's referenced in the service. Could it be? Let me find. Okay, it's actually part of the service, so that doesn't work well. So it can't be static. Let me do like this then. So you can see I haven't carried it out fully. So let me extract this as a method. And then I won't make this static. You can see now it is static, right? So now if I return back to my original, I would make use of the handler function. And that doesn't need an input. So already I simplified this code in that we're actually making use of a static function here. Now it's still quite complex, so we can separate it out even more. So what I'd like to do then is to examine the levels in the function, and then I see this is the lowest level. And in a sense, what we're doing here is to create a user for all the located users. So I would, again, the way I'm selecting, guys, is to press on Control W. As I said previously, this incrementally increases the size of your selection. And I find it very convenient. So now I selected everything within this for loop. You can see here, everything is selected down to the bottom. Then I do refactor this as a method. And then I say create user. In a sense, this is what it's doing. So for each search user, create user. Now let's examine, do this even more. So now this is green, this is green, and this is green. So now if you look to the cyclomatic complexity, it's a bit difficult to pronounce. Everything is green now. So basically what I've done so far is to take this function and partition it out and spread it out in smaller functions. But one thing you should realize, this file is quite large and too large in my mind. So we should apply some techniques to move code out of this file and into some other file. So let me show you one technique that I'm applying. So let me first locate the function. And in this context, I will insert another class. Often I call these functional classes worker classes. Basically, they are inherently static classes, as at least in my convention. It doesn't contain any data structures, only functions. So this will be the recipient of all the static functions that we are going to move out of this main class. It will be a static class. Let's go back to this one. So now I want to move this static function to the static class. So there's an option here called move to another type. And I want to select the one I created. And I have already given this named with get user handler, and so they're easy to find, right? They are in sequence here, and so I just go next now. It will complain that it will not be accessible. I will fix that later on. So you can see here it's complaining that this is not accessible. So what I want to do is I want to go and make this function, move it to this class as well. So it's located. Sorry, that was this function. So we want to move this function also to the same file. Move. By the way, there's a convention in Radar and WebStorm. If you want to paste something, not the previous, but the older version of the clipboard, you can actually press Shift Control C. Sorry, Control. Sorry. Shift Control V. Sorry, for paste, and you can then select actually what you want. So I'm actually looking for this one to move into. Next. So now you can see that I slimmed down the function to be this one. So everything is now in this file is this function only. So I removed quite a few lines of code. Most of the code has moved to this static file, yeah. So hopefully you can appreciate what I've done as an exercise to take a fairly complex function, split it up, transform its parameters, and then move most of the logic into worker class, which is a static class, which does most of the logic implementation down here. If I could just comment on something else I don't like with this implementation is that you can see here, if you look closely to these if tests, it follows a very regular pattern. There's only a few changes between these two lines. There's name, here's this mail. So this is, I would say, a bad copy paste practice. Again, I would probably spend a few minutes to see if I can find a common solution for most of these obvious copies of each other, but I won't go into details today. So I think that's sufficient for the first refactoring. I wanted to just highlight this function as well, because it's a very good example of something which is very overly complicated. You would see that this is 300% above the threshold value, and certainly a good candidate for refactoring. So should you ever need to make changes to this function, your first step would not be fix the problem or add more functionality to it, but the first step would be immediately to refactor it so that it's actually manageable. I would say this is not manageable to be maintained anymore. So if you see this coming up on during your workday, then you really for your first step would to refactor it, please. So I wanted to also show you example in TypeScript. And I need to open another solution for that. See if I have it open. No. Should be recent and in main branch. Again, you can see here, as I open it, I immediately see that my changes is collective. So let me just bring it down here. So any changes I now make will be separated out. Sorry. Why is it giving me this entry point? Okay, so this is the function we're talking about. So there's one thing which I struggle to find. If I try to open the refactoring menu, you would see there's no option to join the arguments into a structure or class. In fact, there's another way to do this in WebStorm, and that is to press Alt key and hit Enter key button. So this I had to find on their website because I was thinking, why shouldn't it be possible to do this type of refactoring in WebStorm? And in fact, it is possible here. So as you can see here, there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 arguments to this function. So very good candidate to be merged into a single argument. So let's do that first. And using this convert parameters to object and interface. And from our convention, I would do save view groups args. And I'm not done yet because I wanted to not split the arguments like this. I want to use it as a single input. So I want to do is to use this option, replace destructing with property and index access. Let's call it args. Now, this refactoring isn't foolproof, actually. It's confusing the refactored code with some existing code. So, but it's actually highlighting these problems. So I will just quickly fix that. But now we can see change the code so that the input is a single input. And this becomes important later on when I refactor more of a function. Having 10 input values here to be passed on to another function that you are going to extract out of it is kind of messy. Yes, you can see here, these underscores are indicating some bad code practice. Let me simplify. And then I can do this for all pointless statements and Boolean expressions in file. Let me just execute this one. And you can see all these yellow underscores are resolved at once. So just scanning through this, and there's a number of options to be done for refactoring, but certainly one is to take care of what is done down here. So let me just copy the function name. I like to use this convention. And then again, do refactor my extracting method. You can choose which destination, right? I often use the class. So now this function is responsible for handling the confirmed case. So you can see it's easier to read. I think I'll stop there because I think I already spent quite a lot of time in refactoring, but you can see the main focus I have for refactoring is to split large functions into smaller ones. And then I would also try out to see if this is possible to be made static. And I find that it's not possible. So I would then examine, is these properties something that you can be static? And if they're all convertible to static, it's an easy way to just move it, the logic of the class and into a worker class. But often you would see there's a very tight link between the class and the logic, in which case you would need to use some other techniques to actually separate them out. But yeah, don't forget about this technique of making a function static, because it's a very convenient way to check what linkage is between the function and the global context, or the class context, I would say. The global context is always accessible in Angular. So yes, are there anything else you wonder about as far as refactoring? Hopefully you understand that WebStorm and also Radar has excellent support for you when you want to refactor, and hope you make use of that going forward.
Well, I have just one small comment.
Yes.
Of course, Radar and WebStorm are really useful and helpful to refactor any, let's say, old code. But I think we need not to forget that in some places, for example, we have different, let's say, layers connected to each other really, really close. Let's say getting data from data access and instantly putting them to business object without any distance between this logic. And I think we need to use this tool, of course, but also to have some, let's say, paradigm how we want to have these layers on architecture side, because anyway it will be easier to understand if we will have clear layers like this data access, this business logic, and this is views like UI. Doesn't matter is it WinForms or Angular. So it's a little bit another part of refactoring.
I agree. So I want to just highlight the techniques around clean coding, but it doesn't. I didn't want to go into details about data models and structures, because I think I have like 4 topics on this. So
I see. Okay.
Step 3, 4, 6, and 7 can be considered kind of questions and answers, or just around what you're saying now. How to separate out business logic from data models and things like that.
Yeah, because approach can be different, and it will be nice to have, let's say, common line, because then you know when you refactor what we want to achieve.
Yes. Yes.
Okay.
I agree. It's very good that everyone understands what a good data model is and what a good business logic model is, and then when you create your own or extend on existing one, you know how to properly do that in the context of that we have agreed on. Good. Any other comments? No? In that case, I want to end the seminar now and wish everyone a good day, and let's meet again to Scrum on Scrum tomorrow. So bye-bye for now.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Have a nice day.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.